Something unusual was seen in the sky over Italy in the 1930s. Not a distant light, not something easily dismissed, but an object, structured, controlled, and unlike anything known at the time. And according to later accounts, it didn't just disappear. It came down, recovered, quietly, studied in secrecy, and then removed from public view. There are no confirmed images today, no official explanation, only fragments of records, and a question that never fully went away. Because if something like that was found that early, then what exactly was it? Forbidden book, hidden in Vatican shadows. There are books that are meant to be read, and then there are books that were never meant to be found somewhere within the archives of the Vatican, behind controlled access, beneath layers of history and preservation. There are texts that rarely leave their place, not displayed, not discussed openly among them. There is a story about a book that appears suddenly in history, without a clear origin, without a confirmed author, a manuscript known by a name that feels almost too deliberate, the Grand Grimoire, sometimes called the Red Dragon. At first, it reads like many other texts from its time, pages filled with symbols, instructions, ritual language. But the deeper you look, the more something begins to feel different, because this is not just a record. It presents itself as a guide, not to knowledge in the usual sense, but to control, to influence, to access something beyond what is normally reachable. And that is, the discomfort begins. The origins of the Grand Grimoire are unclear. Some place it in the 18th century, others suggest it draws from much older material. Fragments carried forward, rewritten, preserved in parts. There is no single version, no original copy that can be confirmed with certainty, only variations. Copies of copies. Texts that shift slightly depending on where they appear, which makes it difficult to trace, difficult to place within a clear timeline. And yet, the structure of the text remains consistent. It describes a process step by step, precise, ordered, as if it was meant to be followed, not interpreted, not studied from a distance, but used. The instructions are specific: times of day, materials, positions, details that suggest intention rather than imagination, and that is what makes it stand out. Because most texts like this are symbolic, open to interpretation, but this one feels direct, almost practical, which raises a question that is difficult to ignore. Was it ever meant to be real? Or was it written to appear that way? The Vatican archives themselves are often misunderstood. They are not a single hidden vault, but a vast collection of documents preserved across centuries, carefully organized, restricted, not because they are mysterious, but because they are fragile, important. And yet, within such a collection there are always texts that do not fit easily, texts that are preserved but not promoted, because their meaning is unclear, their origin uncertain, their purpose questionable. The Grand Grimoire is often placed into that category, not officially confirmed as part of any central archive, but associated with the idea of hidden texts, documents that exist on the edge of recorded history. The language used in the manuscript is also unusual, formal structured, but carrying a tone that feels different from religious or philosophical writing. It does not ask questions, it instructs. And that distinction matters, because instruction implies certainty, and certainty in a text like this feels out of place. Some sections describe preparation, not just physical, but mental, a process of focus, isolation, repetition, which shifts the experience of reading it, from observation to involvement. And that may be intentional because the structure of the text is not passive. It draws the reader in step by step until the distance between reading and doing becomes less clear. Over time, the manuscript has been studied, analyzed, compared to other grimoires, and many of its elements can be traced to earlier traditions, fragments of older systems, reorganized combined. But even with that understanding, the way it is presented remains distinct, more direct, more focused, which is why it continues to be referenced not as a confirmed historical document, but as something that sits just outside clear classification. There are also questions about how widely it was used, because a text can exist without being applied, written but not followed, and in many cases, that is where such manuscripts remain as objects, not actions. But the tone of the Grand Grimoire suggests otherwise. It does not feel like something meant to sit untouched. It feels like something meant to be attempted. And that difference is subtle, but important, because it changes how the text is perceived, not just as a document, but as a possibility, and possibility is harder to contain than information. The idea of forbidden knowledge is not new. Throughout history, there have always been boundaries between what is accepted and what is not, between what is studied openly and what is kept aside. Not always because it is dangerous, but because it does not fit easily into existing systems. The Grand Grimoire exists within that space, not fully rejected, not fully accepted, but present, referenced, and still not completely understood. Today, the manuscript continues to circulate in different forms: printed versions, digital copies, interpretations, but none of them can be traced back with certainty to a single origin, which means what exists now is not necessarily what existed then, only a continuation, a version that has passed through time, changing slightly but remaining recognizable. And that continuity keeps the story alive, because even without confirmation, even without a verified original, the idea persists. A book that appeared without clear origin, a text that reads like instruction, a manuscript that feels slightly out of place, not because it is hidden, but because it does not settle easily into explanation. And maybe that is where it remains. Not in the archives, not in a single location, but in the space between history and interpretation. And somewhere within that space between what was written and what was understood, there is still a question. Not about whether it exists, but about what it was ever meant to be, and whether it was meant to be found at all. The Vatican's secret UFO encounter cover-up. Some events don't become history, not because they didn't happen, but because they were never meant to stay visible. In the early 20th century, long before modern discussions of unidentified objects, there are records of something unusual, a report, not widely published, not openly discussed, but referenced quietly across different sources. It describes an object not shaped like anything familiar seen in the sky over northern Italy in the 1930s. At first, it was just an observation, a sighting, something noticed and then questioned. But then the story changes, because according to some accounts, the object did not disappear. It came down near a place called Magenta, and what followed was not public. There are no widely accepted photographs, no confirmed physical evidence available today. Only fragments, descriptions, references that appear and then fade, which makes the story difficult to place. Not clearly documented, but not entirely absent either. The time period matters. Italy, in the 1930s, was under strict control. Information was managed, filtered, restricted, which means if something unusual did occur, it would not have been openly shared. Some accounts suggest that the object was recovered, not destroyed, not lost but taken, studied and placed under control. A small group tasked with examining it carefully, quietly, without public awareness. And this is where the Vatican becomes part of the story. Not directly confirmed, but connected through suggestion. Because the Vatican, at that time, was one of the few institutions capable of preserving information across generations. Documents, records, knowledge that extended beyond a single government, which leads to a possibility that information about the event may not have been lost but transferred, stored somewhere, not meant for public access. The object itself, as described in later references, was, unlike known aircraft of the time, smooth, structured, without visible propulsion in the way people expected. And that detail stands out, because in the 1930s, aviation was still developing. Technology was limited, which means anything beyond that level would have been difficult to explain. Some interpretations suggest experimental aircraft early prototypes. But the descriptions do not fully match, and that leaves a gap, not proof, but uncertainty. After the initial reports, the story becomes quieter, less defined, as if something was intentionally reduced, removed from attention, which is not unusual because many events, especially those that do not fit expectations, are often handled that way. Not erased completely, but minimized, left without continuation, so that over time they become unclear. The connection to the Vatican remains indirect. There is no single document that confirms involvement, only references that suggest information may have passed through different channels. And that possibility is enough, because the Vatican archives are known for their scale, a vast collection of documents spanning centuries, many accessible, many not. Not because they are hidden in a dramatic sense, but because they are preserved, restricted, maintained under specific conditions. And within a collection like that, there are always records that do not fit easily into categories, documents that exist but are not widely discussed. The idea of an early UFO encounter stored within such archives is difficult to confirm, but also difficult to dismiss entirely, because the absence of evidence is not always the same as absence of record, and that distinction matters over time. The story has resurfaced in different forms, mentions in research, references in declassified materials, connections drawn between separate pieces of information, but never a complete account, never a single source that brings everything together, which keeps it in a state of uncertainty, not fully accepted, not fully rejected, just unresolved. And maybe that is where it remains, not as a confirmed event, but as a possibility, something that may have happened, something that may have been recorded, and something that may have been stored rather than shared. Because history is not only made of what is known, but also of what is kept, what is preserved, and what is allowed to remain unclear. Standing at that edge between record and absence, this story does not provide answers, it offers fragments, moments that suggest something unusual occurred, but not enough to fully explain it. And somewhere within those fragments, between the sighting, the recovery, the silence that followed, there is still a question. Not just about what was seen, but about what was done with it afterward, and whether that answer still exists. Not in open history, but somewhere quieter. The Pope who died after 33 days, and why. Some moments in history seem complete on the surface. Dates recorded, events documented, explanations provided in a way that should leave no room for doubt. And yet, every now and then, something remains slightly out of place. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to keep the question open. In 1978, a new pope was elected. It was a period of transition. Following the death of Pope Paul VI, the world was watching, but not expecting anything unusual. And when the decision was announced, the choice felt safe. His name was Pope John Paul I, born Albino Luciani, a man known for humility, simplicity, and a noticeably different tone from many before him. From the beginning, there was something about him that stood out, not authority, not power, but presence. He spoke in a way that felt more direct, less formal, less distant. He smiled often, and that detail, small as it seems, changed how people perceived him. There was a sense that things might shift, not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. A softer approach, a different direction, something that hadn't fully taken shape yet. And then, after just 33 days, everything stopped. His death was announced quickly. The explanation was immediate. A heart attack. Unexpected, but natural. At first, there was no reason to question it. Sudden deaths happen, even in positions of importance, even in places that feel controlled. But over time, small details began to draw attention. Not large contradictions, not obvious inconsistencies, but subtle differences. Accounts of how he was found were not exactly the same. Some reports mentioned one person, others mentioned another. Timing shifted slightly depending on the source. Individually, these details seemed minor, but together, they created something less clear. And that lack of clarity is what remained. The timeline of his final hours became a point of focus. What he was doing, what he had been reviewing, who he had spoken to. There were suggestions that he had been looking into internal matters, financial structures, administrative decisions, changes that may have affected the direction of the institution. None of this was confirmed in a way that settled the question, but the idea persisted, because timing matters. A short papacy, followed by sudden death, combined with the suggestion of upcoming changes, creates a pattern that invites attention, not proof but possibility. The Vatican maintained its position, consistent, clear, unchanged. The cause was natural. There was no reason to look further. And for many, that was enough. Because not every event needs a deeper explanation. Sometimes, things happen without complexity, but not everyone felt that way. Writers began to explore the gaps. Journalists looked closer at the timeline. Books were published, each offering a slightly different interpretation. Some focused on internal reform, others on financial systems connected to the Vatican. Some went further, suggesting connections that extended beyond what could be verified. And this is where the story becomes more difficult to navigate, because it moves from fact into interpretation. The facts remain limited. A man elected a short period of leadership, a sudden death. Everything else exists around those points, trying to explain what cannot be fully confirmed. The number itself, 33 days, continues to stand out. Not long enough to establish change, not short enough to be ignored, just enough to feel incomplete, as if something had begun but never had the chance to continue, and that sense of interruption stays with the story, because it is not based on evidence alone but on perception, on timing. On the idea of what might have happened if time had been longer. But that version of events does not exist, only the one that ended early. Over time, the discussion around his death has not disappeared, but it has changed. Less immediate, less intense, more distant, but still present, occasionally returning through articles, books, or renewed interest, always centered around the same point. Not what is known, but what is not fully explained, because uncertainty does not require large gaps. Even small ones are enough if they remain unresolved. The official explanation still stands. Clear, consistent, unchanged. And yet, the questions remain alongside it. Not replacing it, not disproving it, but existing quietly in the background, and maybe that is where this story belongs. Not as something that demands a conclusion, but as something that never fully settled. A moment in history that appears complete but feels slightly unfinished. And somewhere within that space between record and uncertainty, between explanation and perception, there is still a question. Not loud, not urgent, but present and still unanswered. The cloth that claims to be Jesus' death record. Some objects don't just exist as artifacts, they exist as questions. Not because they are hidden, but because even when they are seen clearly, they are not fully understood. There is a piece of cloth preserved, studied, displayed at times, and then returned to careful storage. It carries the faint image of a human figure, front and back, not painted, not drawn in a way that is immediately recognizable, but present, subtle, almost as if it appeared rather than being created. This is known as the Shroud of Turin. For centuries, it has been described as something extraordinary, a burial cloth believed by some to have wrapped the body of Jesus, a physical record of a moment that exists at the center of belief, history, and interpretation. But the cloth itself does not explain what it is. It does not confirm. It does not deny. It simply exists. The image on the cloth is unlike most forms of representation. It is not composed of visible brush strokes, not formed through traditional methods of pigment. Instead, the coloration appears on the very surface of the fibers, shallow, extremely thin, which means the image is not embedded deeply into the material. It sits at the outermost level, and that detail matters because it changes how the image could have been formed. Over time, the cloth has been studied using different techniques: photography, microscopy, chemical analysis, each approach revealing more detail, but not a complete explanation. One of the most striking discoveries came through photography. When the image was first captured on film, the negative appeared clearer than the original, details becoming more defined, as if the image itself was reversed, which is not typical for artwork, and that unexpected result shifted the way the cloth was viewed, from object to puzzle. There are also markings on the cloth patterns that resemble wounds, aligned in ways that match historical descriptions of crucifixion, positions, locations, details that appear consistent. But consistency does not equal confirmation, because interpretation plays a role, and interpretation depends on perspective. In the late 20th century, a carbon dating test was performed. The results suggested a medieval origin, placing the cloth between the 13th and 14th centuries, which would mean it could not be what it is believed to be, at least not in a literal sense. And for many, that seemed to resolve the question. But the discussion did not end there, because later analysis raised concerns about the sample used, whether it was representative of the entire cloth, whether repairs or contamination may have influenced the result. And that reopened the question, not fully, but enough to keep the uncertainty in place. There are also studies that examine the image itself, its depth, its formation, its lack of directional brush marks. Some suggest natural processes, chemical reactions, heat light. But none of these explanations fully account for all observed details, which leaves the image in a position that is difficult to define, not clearly created through known methods, but not beyond explanation either, just incomplete. The cloth has also been treated as an object of devotion, not only studied but revered, which adds another dimension, because now it exists in two spaces at once, as an artifact and as a symbol. And those two perspectives do not always align. Science seeks explanation, faith accepts meaning, and the shroud exists between them, without fully belonging to either. The preservation of the cloth has been careful, controlled conditions, limited exposure, because time affects all materials, and once something is damaged, it cannot be restored completely, which means access has always been restricted, not to hide it, but to protect it. And that limitation contributes to the sense of distance, because the object is known but not fully accessible, and space between visibility and access creates curiosity. People continue to study it, to analyze it, to compare findings, each new method offering more detail, but not final answers. And maybe that is what keeps it present, not as something solved, but as something that remains open, because the question is not simple, not just what the cloth is, but how the image formed and whether that process can be fully explained without assumption, without interpretation, only through evidence. But evidence, in this case, is incomplete, not missing entirely, but not conclusive. And so the cloth remains preserved, studied, observed across centuries, still carrying the same image, still raising the same question. And somewhere within that image, between what can be measured and what can only be interpreted, there is still a space not filled, not resolved, just present. The Vatican's hidden role during the Holocaust. Some parts of history are recorded in detail: dates, documents, names that can be traced and verified. And then there are parts that exist more quietly, not absent, but not fully visible either. During the Second World War, as events unfolded across Europe, there were decisions being made in many places at once. Some public, some private, some recorded clearly, others left in fragments. The Vatican existed in a unique position during this time, a small independent state, surrounded by a country under the control of a larger regime. Neutral in status, but not isolated from what was happening around it. And that created a situation that was not simple, because neutrality does not remove responsibility, but it changes how actions are taken. Officially, the Vatican maintained a position of distance, not aligning directly with either side, not openly confronting the powers involved, and this approach has been studied, debated, and questioned ever since. But alongside the official position, there are accounts of something quieter, actions that did not appear in public statements, efforts that were not announced, because they were not meant to be. In Rome and surrounding areas, there are records of monasteries, convents, and church properties providing shelter, not openly but discreetly, to people who were being targeted, families, individuals, those who needed somewhere to disappear, even if only temporarily. These places were not designed for that purpose, but they became part of a network, not formally structured, but connected through necessity. Doors opened, rooms were given, identities sometimes changed, not documented in full detail, because documentation itself could be dangerous, which means much of what happened exists through testimony, through records created later, through accounts that vary in detail, and that makes the full picture difficult to reconstruct, because absence of record does not mean absence of action, but it does limit certainty. The role of Pope Pius XII during this period is one of the most discussed aspects. Some argue that his silence was a failure, that more could have been said, more could have been done publicly. Others suggest that silence was a strategy, that open opposition could have led to greater harm, that actions taken quietly may have protected more lives. Both perspectives exist, and neither fully removes the questions, because this is not a simple situation. It involves choices made under pressure with limited options, where every action carries consequences, visible or not. Some documents released decades later have added detail, letters, records, references to assistance provided. But even these do not complete the picture. They fill parts of it, but not all, because many actions were never formally recorded, and those that were may not have been preserved completely. Estimates suggest that thousands of people found refuge in religious buildings during this time, hidden, protected, moved when necessary, but exact numbers remain uncertain, because secrecy was part of the process, and secrecy leaves gaps. The Vatican's position during the Holocaust continues to be studied, not as a fixed conclusion, but as an ongoing discussion, because new information continues to emerge. Archives open gradually, documents are re-examined, interpretations shift, but the central question remains, not just what happened, but how it was handled, what was chosen, and why standing at a distance. Now it is easier to look back and expect clarity, but at the time clarity was not always available. Decisions were made in uncertainty, with incomplete information, under conditions that do not translate easily into simple judgment, and that is what makes this part of history difficult. Not because it is hidden, but because it is complex, because it exists between action and silence, between what was done and what was said, and those two do not always align. Today, the story remains, not as a single narrative, but as multiple perspectives, each focusing on different aspects: public statements, private actions, moral responsibility, practical limitation, all part of the same moment, but not fully unified. And maybe that is where it remains. Not as something unresolved in the sense of missing, but unresolved in the sense of interpretation, because the facts exist, but their meaning is still being understood. And somewhere within that space, between record and silence, between action and absence, there is still a question. Not about whether something was done, but about how much of it was ever meant to be seen. The Ark of the Covenant, is it in the Vatican? Some objects are described so clearly that they begin to feel real, even without being seen. A chest made of gold carried carefully, never touched directly, said to hold something more than physical contents. Not just an object, but a presence. This is the Ark of the Covenant, described in ancient texts, detailed in a way that feels specific, measured, constructed with instruction, and then it disappears. No confirmed location, no verified recovery, only references. accounts that place it in different places at different times and then silence. For something described so precisely its absence is noticeable, because objects like this do not simply fade. They are moved, hidden, protected, or lost. But the Ark does not feel like something that would be lost easily because its importance was not ordinary. It was central, carried into battles, placed within sacred space, associated with something beyond explanation, and that is where the question begins. If it existed, what happened to it? Some traditions place it in Ethiopia. Others suggest it was hidden before the destruction of the first temple, moved, sealed away, protected from being taken. But there is another idea, less direct, less openly discussed, that the Ark may not be lost at all, but relocated, transferred, into a place where objects are preserved rather than displayed. And that brings the focus to the Vatican, not because there is proof, but because of possibility. Because the Vatican is one of the few places in the world where objects of extreme historical importance could exist, without being publicly confirmed. Its archives and collections span centuries, documents, artifacts, items that have passed through time. Some known, many not hidden in the way stories suggest, but preserved, restricted, maintained within systems that are not fully visible from the outside. And within a system like that, there is space for objects that do not fit easily into public history. The Ark, if it existed as described, would be one of those objects, not something that could be displayed, not something that could be easily explained, because its meaning is not only historical, it is symbolic, religious, and potentially something more. Descriptions of the Ark include details that stand out, a container, but not just for storage, said to hold tablets, representations of law, but also associated with events that feel unusual, accounts of energy, of presence, of effects that are not easily explained, not confirmed but repeated across different sources. And repetition creates weight, not proof but attention. Some interpretations attempt to explain these descriptions. Natural phenomena, symbolic language, ways of describing experiences that could not be understood at the time. And that is possible. But it does not remove the question, because the object itself remains unaccounted for. The Vatican has, over time, responded to many claims, clarifying, denying, maintaining that no such object exists within its collections. And officially, that remains the position, clear, consistent. But official statements do not always end speculation, because speculation does not rely only on confirmation. It exists in the space where information is limited, where access is restricted, where not everything can be seen directly. And that space is where ideas like this continue, not because they are proven, but because they are possible. History is not only made of what is shown, it is also shaped by what is preserved, what is stored, what is kept beyond immediate reach. And institutions like the Vatican have always existed within that balance between visibility and protection, between knowledge and restriction, which is why questions like this remain, not answered, but not dismissed completely either. Because the Ark, whether it exists or not, has never been fully resolved. It appears clearly in one part of history and then disappears without a definitive end, and objects without endings tend to remain in discussion because they leave something open, a space where explanation should be, but isn't in. And maybe that is where this belongs. Not as a confirmed truth, not as a proven theory, but as a question that continues quietly, across time, between what is recorded and what is not fully revealed. And somewhere within that space, between belief and history, between presence and absence, there is still a possibility. Not visible, not confirmed, but not entirely gone either. Fake mummies that fooled the Vatican. Some discoveries don't begin with mystery. They begin with certainty. An object is found, preserved, placed within a collection, identified, and accepted. For years, sometimes decades, there is no reason to question it. Until something small changes. A new method. A different way of looking. And suddenly, what seemed clear isn't. in collections connected to the Vatican. There are artifacts that have passed through generations of study objects from different regions, different time periods, carefully preserved, among them mummified remains, bodies wrapped, prepared, presented as part of ancient burial traditions. At first, they appear authentic. The wrapping is consistent, the form recognizable. Everything matches expectation. And that is what makes them convincing, because they fit the pattern. They look exactly how they are supposed to look. But appearance is not always the same as reality. As technology advanced, new tools became available, non-invasive methods, ways to look beneath the surface without disturbing the object itself. CT scans, imaging techniques, methods that reveal structure without altering it. And when these methods were applied, something unexpected appeared. Not in all cases, but in enough to raise attention. Inside some of these mummies, there was no human body, not complete, not intact. Sometimes fragments, sometimes nothing at all. Instead, materials, objects placed inside to create the shape of a body, arranged carefully, wrapped convincingly, designed to appear real, and for a long time, it worked. Because without looking inside, there was no reason to doubt it. Which raises a quiet question. Why were they made this way? Because creating a false mummy requires effort, time skill, understanding of how a real one should appear, and that suggests intention, not random, not accidental, deliberate. Some explanations point to trade artifacts created to be sold, objects designed to meet demand, because in certain periods, ancient items were highly valued, collected, purchased, displayed, and not all of them were genuine. Others suggest ritual reasons, symbolic representations, objects created for meaning rather than preservation. But not all cases fit neatly into one explanation, because the details vary. Some are carefully constructed, others less so, which suggests different origins, different purposes, different intentions. And that complexity makes the discovery more difficult to define, because it is not one story. It is multiple, connected by the same result, objects that appeared real, but were not what they seemed. The Vatican's collections, like many large institutions, have evolved over time, items acquired in different ways through different periods, not always with the same level of verification, which means some objects entered collections based on trust, on appearance, on the knowledge available at the time, and that not unusual because methods change. Understanding improves. What was once accepted can later be questioned, and that process is part of study, not a failure, but a correction. Still, there is something about these cases that stays in the mind because the objects were convincing, not obviously false, not easy to identify as imitation. They passed as real until they didn't. And that shift from certainty to uncertainty is what creates the tension, because it changes how everything is viewed, not just the object itself, but the system around it. How many others might exist? How many have not been examined in the same way? And how often appearance has been accepted without deeper verification? But this is not about deception alone, it is also about context. The time in which these objects were created, the reasons behind their construction, which may not have been purely to mislead but to fulfill a purpose, even if that purpose is no longer fully understood. Today, these mummies are still studied, not discarded, not ignored, but re-examined as part of a broader understanding. Because even something that is not authentic still holds information about the people who made it, about the time it came from, about the intention behind it, and that shifts the perspective from false to something else, something that still has value, even if it is not what it first appeared to be. But the question remains not just why they were made, but how easily they were accepted, and what that says about the way we interpret the past. Because sometimes what looks real is not, and sometimes it takes time and a different way of seeing to recognize that difference. And somewhere within that shift between appearance and reality, between certainty and doubt, there is still a quiet reminder that not everything preserved from history is exactly what it seems. Nero's $2 billion bathtub, hidden in plain sight. Some objects don't look rare at first. They sit in open spaces, seen by thousands of people, photographed, walked past, and because they are visible, they are often overlooked. There is a large stone basin displayed within the Vatican museums. Visitors pass by it. Some pause, some don't. It appears simple. A carved piece of stone, smooth, heavy, but its value is not immediately obvious, because what it is made from is not ordinary. This basin is carved from a material known as porphyry, a deep red stone, dense, difficult to shape. In the ancient world, it was one of the most valuable materials available, not because of rarity alone, but because of control. Porphyry came from specific quarries, primarily in Egypt, and access to it was limited, restricted to imperial authority, which means its use was not common. It was reserved for emperors, for structures and objects that carried power. And that is where this object begins to change, because what looks like a simple basin is actually something that required immense effort to create. The stone itself would have been extracted, transported across distance, shaped with tools that were far less advanced than those used today. And shaping porphyry is not easy. It resists cutting. It resists refinement, which means the process would have taken time, skill, consistency, and that level of effort suggests importance, not decoration, but intention. The basin is often associated with Emperor Nero, a figure known for excess, for scale, for projects that extended beyond practicality, and while the exact origin of the object is still discussed, its connection to imperial use remains strong, which changes how it is viewed. Because now it is not just a carved object. It becomes part of a larger system, a display of power, a material that could only be used by those who controlled its source, and that exclusivity carries weight. In modern terms, the value of such an object has been estimated in extreme ranges, sometimes described in numbers that feel almost unreal, not because of market price alone, but because of what it represents: time-labor control, things that cannot be easily measured, and yet it sits in a museum, visible, accessible, not hidden, which creates an unusual contrast because something of that level of historical value might be expected to be protected differently, more restricted, more separated, but instead it exists in open view, and that openness changes perception, because when something is constantly visible, it becomes familiar, and familiarity reduces attention. Even when the object itself is extraordinary, the surface of the basin is smooth, carefully shaped, not decorative in a complex way, but precise. And that precision reflects the material. Porphyry does not allow for careless work. It requires control. And that control is visible in the form. Even without ornamentation, the simplicity becomes part of its identity because it does not need additional detail. The material itself is enough. Over time, objects like this have been moved, reused, reinterpreted. What may have once served one purpose becomes something else. A basin, a display piece, removed from its original context, placed within a new one. And that shift changes, meaning because the object remains the same, but the environment around it changes, which means how it is understood also changes. What was once a symbol of exclusive power becomes an artifact, something observed, studied, and sometimes overlooked. The idea that such an object could exist in plain sight without drawing constant attention is not unusual because attention is selective. People notice what they expect to notice and pass by what they do not immediately recognize. And that is what happens here. The basin remains unchanged in its material, unchanged in its structure, but changing in how it is perceived, depending on who is looking at it. Some see a large stone object. Others see a connection to imperial history, a reflection of a time when material itself was controlled, and that difference in perception is what defines its presence today, because the object does not explain itself. It does not display its history openly, it simply exists and requires recognition to be fully understood. And maybe that is where the interest remains, not in what it is made of, but in what it represents. A level of effort, a level of control, a system of value that is no longer visible in the same way, but still exists. Within the object itself, and somewhere between its past and its present, between what it once meant and what it appears to be. Now, there is a quiet contrast, not hidden, not secret, but easy to miss and still present. The UFO that appeared over St. Peter's Dome. Some sightings don't last long enough to become evidence, but they last just long enough to be remembered. And sometimes that's all it takes. A moment in the sky, brief and quiet, seen by a few people who weren't expecting anything unusual, and gone before it could be understood. Above Vatican City, the skyline is dominated by a single structure, a dome that has remained unchanged for centuries, rising above everything around it with a sense of permanence that feels almost fixed in time. St. Peter's Basilica is not just a building, it is a reference point, something constant, something that does not shift or change in ways that draw attention. And because of that, anything that appears near it immediately stands out. There have been reports, not frequent and not officially confirmed, but repeated enough to exist beyond a single account, of objects appearing above that dome, not clearly identifiable, not matching the movement or sound of aircraft, and not remaining long enough to be examined closely. The descriptions are not identical, but they share certain similarities that make them difficult to ignore completely. Some describe a light, steady, and controlled, not flickering, not moving in the way distant objects usually do. Others describe something more structured, a shape that appears defined but unfamiliar, something that does not match anything easily recognized. What stands out most is not the appearance itself, but the behavior. These objects do not follow expected patterns. They appear suddenly, remain for a short period, and then disappear without clear direction. No gradual movement away, no fading into distance, just absence where something was visible moments before. In most cases, there is no sound, and that detail matters more than it seems because movement in the sky is usually accompanied by noise, even at a distance, even when barely noticeable. But in these accounts, that connection is missing, which makes the moment feel quieter than it should be. Of course, there are explanations. There always are. Atmospheric conditions can distort light. Objects at high altitude can appear closer than they are. Reflections, angles, and timing can create shapes that seem unfamiliar. And in many cases, those explanations are enough, but not always. Because some observations do not settle into those explanations easily, they remain slightly outside of them, not contradicting them completely, but not fitting perfectly either. And that is where the uncertainty stays, not in proving something unusual, but in not being able to fully explain it. The setting itself plays a role. Vatican City is open, visible, constantly observed. There are always people present, always movement, always attention, which means anything unusual in the sky is more likely to be noticed, but also more likely to be dismissed quickly, because unusual does not always mean significant. And yet, repetition changes that. Not a single sighting, but multiple, separated by time, connected by place, each one brief, each one incomplete, but together, forming a pattern that is difficult to ignore entirely. There are no official confirmations, no statements, that identify these objects as anything beyond misinterpretation, and without clear evidence, that position remains reasonable, because confirmation requires more than observation. It requires consistency, documentation, and verifiable detail. But absence of confirmation does not erase the experience of those who saw something. It only limits what can be concluded from it, and that creates a space between what is seen and what is accepted, a space where events exist without resolution over time. These sightings become quieter. They are mentioned occasionally, then set aside. Not forgotten completely, but not explored deeply either, because without new information, There is nowhere for the story to go. It remains a moment, not a conclusion, and moments, especially brief ones, are difficult to hold on to. They rely on memory, on description, on the ability to recall something that was never fully understood in the first place. Standing in Vatican City, looking up at the dome, the structure feels permanent, unchanging, grounded in history, but the sky above it is not. It shifts constantly, open, unpredictable, impossible to control. And that contrast matters because it allows for moments like this to exist. Something fixed below, something uncertain above. A brief appearance, a quiet observation, and then nothing. No trace, no continuation, just the memory that something was there. And somewhere within that gap, between what was seen and what can be explained, the question remains. Not loud, not urgent, but present. What exactly appeared above the dome and why did it leave so quickly? The pine cone symbol. No one can explain. Some symbols appear so often that they stop being noticed. They become part of the background, something familiar enough to ignore even when their meaning isn't fully understood. And sometimes, the more visible something is, the less it is questioned. In the Vatican, within a quiet courtyard surrounded by stone and open sky, there stands a large bronze structure. At first glance, it seems decorative, almost simple in its form. A pine cone, large, detailed, placed at the center of a space that feels intentionally arranged. It does not hide. It is not behind glass. It is not restricted. And yet, its meaning is not clearly explained. The sculpture is known as the Pigna, a massive bronze pine cone that dates back to ancient Rome, long before it became part of the Vatican's collection. It was not originally created for this space. It was moved, repositioned, given a new context, and with that shift, its meaning became less certain, because symbols often depend on where they are placed, and when they are moved, something changes. The pine cone itself is not a rare symbol. It appears in different cultures, across different time periods, often carrying meanings related to growth, renewal, or continuity in nature. It holds seeds, a contained structure that eventually opens, releasing something that continues beyond it. And that idea has been interpreted in many ways: life, expansion, awareness. But interpretation is not the same as confirmation, because while meanings can be suggested, they are not always fixed. The scale of the Vatican pine cone is what makes it different. It is not a small, decorative object. It is large, central, placed in a way that gives it presence. And presence implies intention, not something placed casually, but something meant to be seen. The courtyard itself adds to that feeling: open, symmetrical, balanced, designed in a way that draws attention toward the center. And at that center, the pine cone remains not explained, not labeled with a single clear purpose, just present. Over time, different interpretations have been suggested. Some connect the symbol to ancient traditions, others to spiritual concepts, ideas of awareness, perception, or something beyond the physical. There are also associations made between the pine cone and the human brain, specifically the pineal gland, a small structure located deep within, often described historically as connected to perception or inner awareness. But these connections are interpretive, not confirmed as intentional within this specific context. And that distinction matters because it separates what is known from what is suggested. The origin of the sculpture itself provides some information. It was once part of a fountain water flowing around it. Movement, reflection, interaction with light. And that detail changes how it might have been experienced. Because moving water adds a layer of motion, a dynamic element that no longer exists in the same way. Now it stands still, removed from that original function. And with that removal, some of its original meaning may have shifted. The Vatican has preserved the object, placed it within a carefully designed space, maintained it as part of a larger collection of historical elements, but it does not provide a single explanation for why this symbol remains so central. And that absence of explanation is what keeps it noticeable, not because it is hidden, but because it is visible. Without being fully defined, visitors pass through the courtyard, they see it, they recognize the shape, but recognition does not always lead to understanding. and that is where the symbol remains, between familiarity and meaning. The pine cone does not present itself as a mystery. It does not appear unusual at first, but the more it is considered, the more the question appears. Why this symbol? Why this scale? Why this placement? Because objects that are given central position are rarely accidental, they carry weight, even if that weight is not immediately explained. And over time, as interpretations change, as contexts shift, the original meaning can become less clear, not lost completely, but no longer fixed, which leaves space for different perspectives, different ideas, none fully confirmed, and maybe that is where the symbol continues to exist, not as something hidden, not as something solved, but as something that remains open, a form that is recognized but not fully understood. And somewhere within that space between object and meaning, between placement and purpose, there is still a question, not urgent, not demanding, but present. Why something so visible can remain so quietly unexplained. The UFO the Vatican never explained. Some events are not denied, but they are never fully explained either. They exist in a space where information is present, but incomplete, where something is acknowledged just enough to remain real, but not enough to become clear. In the 1930s, in northern Italy, there are references to something unusual appearing in the sky, not widely reported at the time, not discussed in a way that reached the public clearly, but recorded in fragments across different sources. An object described as structured, controlled, not behaving like anything commonly seen in the air during that period. And what makes the account different is not just the sighting, but what is said to have happened next. According to later references, the object did not simply disappear. It came down near a place called Magenta, an area that at the time would not have expected attention from something like this. And after that moment, the information becomes quieter. There are no widely accepted images, no preserved physical evidence that can be examined directly today. Only descriptions that appear briefly, then stop, and that absence is noticeable, because events that are fully documented tend to leave a trail, but here, the trail is partial, interrupted. The time period matters. Italy in the 1930s operated under strict control of information. What was recorded publicly was filtered. What was considered sensitive was managed differently, which means that if something unusual did occur, it would not necessarily have been shared openly. Some accounts suggest that the object was recovered, not destroyed, not lost, but taken studied, handled by a small group working within limits without public visibility. And this is where the connection to the Vatican begins to appear, not as confirmed involvement, but as a possibility, because the Vatican existed and still exists as an institution capable of preserving information across long periods of time. Documents, records, materials that move through history without always becoming visible within it. And in situations where information is controlled, transferred, or restricted, such institutions become part of the discussion, not because they are proven to be involved, but because they are capable of holding what others do not. Descriptions of the object remain consistent in certain ways. Smooth surface, structured form, no visible propulsion in the way aircraft of that time would have required. And that detail stands out, because aviation in the 1930s was still developing. Technology was limited, visible, mechanical. Anything beyond that level would have been difficult to place within known systems. Some interpretations suggest experimental designs, unreleased aircraft prototypes, but the descriptions do not fully match what was known to exist. And that leaves a gap, not proof, but uncertainty. After the initial references, the story does not continue in a clear way. There are no follow-up records that confirm what happened to the object. No detailed reports that explain its structure, no consistent documentation that tracks it beyond that point. And that is where the event begins to fade. Not erased, but reduced, left without continuation, which is often how events are handled when they do not fit easily into accepted frameworks. Not removed entirely, but not expanded either. Over time, the story reappears in different forms, mentions in research, references in discussions about early unidentified objects, connections drawn between fragments, but never a complete account, always partial, always dependent on interpretation, and that keeps it in a state that is difficult to resolve, not fully accepted, not fully dismissed, existing in between. The Vatican has never provided an explanation connected to such an event, no confirmation, no direct acknowledgement, and without that, the story remains outside official history. But absence of confirmation does not remove the possibility that information exists. It only limits access to it, because not all records are public, not all events are fully shared, and institutions that preserve information often hold more than what is visible at any given time. This does not confirm anything, but it keeps the question open. What was seen, what was recovered, and what happened after? Because the moment itself, the sighting, is only the beginning. The more significant part is what followed. And that is the part that remains unclear. Standing now, with distance from that time, the event does not appear dramatic. It does not present itself as something that changed everything. It appears as a brief interruption, a moment that did not continue. But brief moments can still matter, especially when they are not fully explained, because they leave something behind, not evidence, not confirmation, but a question. And somewhere within that question, between what was observed and what was recorded, between what was handled and what was never fully revealed, there is still a space, not filled, not defined, just present and still unresolved.